Hello, everyone. My name is Bobby. I am one of the adjudication core for NUDC 2020. This video serves as a discussion format for the judge test that all of the adjudicators were obligated to do. We're going to unpack some of the answers of the judge test and also to clarify some of the confusions that we've seen as a pattern coming from a lot of the answers from the N1 judges as well from the invited judges. All right, so let's get to it. Let's start with the true or false section. The first item, a judge should penalize a prime minister that didn't provide definitions of keywords in a motion. The answer to this is false. While it is recommended for a prime minister to define important elements of the words in the motion, but if it does not result into a problem in the debate, then it should not matter, especially when the opening opposition understands and concedes with the setup that the prime minister has provided, then that should be fine. So it is a recommended element of their speech, but it is not a requirement for them to do so, and therefore judges should not penalize the prime minister for not providing a definition of keywords in a motion. The second item, examples or context do not count as extensions for a closing team. The answer to this is also false. As mentioned in the debater and also adjudication seminar, is that extensions count as anything that is new under the sun. So you can bring in new context, new rebuttals, new examples, things that are different and unique that can extend the debate further. So it doesn't have to be the form of like positive material or argumentation. Examples or context can also count as an extension for a closing team. The third item, a team which has the lowest score speaker in the debate is the team that ranks fourth in that debate. This is false. Now, we've seen a lot of judges actually falling for this item. So what this item specifically said is the lowest scored speaker. So it is entirely possible for, say, someone to get, like, let's say a 65, but then their teammate got an 80, and that team can be ranked first, second, or third. So it is entirely possible that a lowest scored speaker in a debate doesn't come from the team that ranks fourth. This was a trick question because I think many people presumed that what we meant was the lowest, like in terms of accumulation of scored team, but that was not the question. And so we felt that a lot of the judges fell for this trap and did not read the item carefully. The fourth item, whips are encouraged to prioritize giving a biased adjudication of the debate than to respond. This is true. So while obviously, being responsive is an inherent sort of like element of speeches in any debate format, what's unique about whips in BP is that it's not like your usual Asian 3-on-3 style kind of whips that just rebuts everything, especially given the fact that there's probably already 6 speeches that have been delivered prior to the whip speech. There's a lot of content being talked about and discussed, and therefore it's critical then for whips to then give a biased adjudication of framing of the arguments in the debate so that the judges can have an easier time to sort of delineate which ones are more important for them to weigh when it comes to their decision making. Item number 5, in a policy motion, the opposition is required to introduce a counter proposal. The answer to this is false. The only obligation of the opposition team is to oppose the motion. So the opposition team does not have an obligation to solve the problem. It is completely legitimate for an opposition team to just say that while we agree that the status quo is problematic, but the motion is going to bring more harm or make the situation worse. So it's much better that we do nothing compared to we do something, but that something only exacerbates the problem or the urgency that is trying to be addressed in the debate. And we've also felt that a lot of the judges answered true for this. It is important to straighten out the record that, again, opposition teams do not have a burden to solve the problem. Opposition teams' burden in a debate is to simply oppose the motion. The next section for true or false. So item number 6, a speech with a lot of facts and statistics should be seen as more persuasive than those without. This is obviously false. It should not matter whether or not you have like factoids and statistics and all of these data, because what is the biggest emphasis when it comes to debating in general is your logical argumentation, how you're able to explain reasonings behind an argumentation. So obviously, if you do have facts, if you do have statistics from your matter file, that would obviously be helpful and can elevate the persuasiveness of your speech, but that does not mean that it's the only way that you can be persuasive, because there might be instances where a speaker only spouts facts and statistics, but no logical reasoning whatsoever. So that is not persuasive. So obviously the most important element is logical argumentation. Facts and statistics should be supplementary to that particular element. Item number 7, speakers who speaks for 6 minutes or less should be penalized by having their score deducted for being under time. This is false, because we are not a format that punishes people for not speaking according to the time limit. It is entirely possible for someone who only spoke for 4 minutes actually have a higher score than someone who spoke for full 7 minutes, because what matters is the content. It might be entirely possible that someone spoke for 7 minutes, but their speech was just a repetition of one single point, and then just being repeated throughout that 7-minute speech. So that is obviously not persuasive. So the critical takeaway from this item is that it does not matter about your time. What should matter is the content that is being delivered using that allocated time for your speeches. The 8th item, a speaker who contradicts their teammate should be judged as less persuasive than the one who didn't. This is true. This is basically one of the most fundamental rules of BP debating, is that you have to maintain consistency internally within a team and also externally within a bench. And so therefore, if you contradict a speaker either in your team or in your bench, then that would be seen as less persuasive, because then it becomes confusing on which one do we believe, right? That you're effectively doing the opposition's job for them by saying something that undermines the premises that has been delivered before. Item number 9, a team that only responds should be punished for not having arguments, positive material, or extension of closing. Again, this is false. So in the old school of doing things, people do separate between arguments and responses, but as debating has evolved, we are now considering everything as points. So contextualization, arguments, examples, responses, all of these are just points of contribution in the debate. And so therefore, it is entirely possible for a team to just run responses on proving harms of the policy without having any arguments, positive material, or extension, and they can actually win the debate. So the answer to this is false. They should not be punished for not having arguments or positive material. Item number 10, lower feedback should be given to fellow panelists who decide to change their decision quickly after listening to other panelists' explanation. This is false. In fact, we highly encourage that in BP adjudication for consensus. So obviously there will be initial different calls between the chairs, the panelists, and the trainees, and that's what conferral process is for, so that you can straighten out the perspective. Maybe one of the panelists did not hear or did not really catch a specific point that the others managed to do. And so therefore, if you're able to compromise and change your decision, that is perfectly fine. And it doesn't really matter if it's quick or if it's longer. Basically, changing your decision should not be penalized in terms of like lower feedback. So this is false. All right, so that concludes the true or false section. Now I'm going to move to the short answers section. All right, item number one, you are the only panelist judging alongside a chair. The chair only starts the discussion in the final 2 or 3 minutes before the 15-minute mark, leaving you no time to properly explain or justify your initial decision, which was different than the chairs. The chair then decides to proceed with their decision without voting. What do you do in this situation? So the answer that we're looking for is as follows. Firstly, you use the remaining time to convince the chair of your decision. If the chair remains unswayed, then you should simply follow the chair's call, as they would have the final casting position. Because even if it came to a vote, you are a solo panelist and you would not have been able to override the chair's decision, given the fact that in even numbered panels, the chair would get 2 votes to break off like potential ties. And so therefore it would not make that much of a difference. However, after the round ends, you as a judge should notify the adjudication core that the chair did very poorly in managing time and moderating a proper discussion. Basically, the procedure of how you should judge and deliberate is violated in this process. It's important for us to have this feedback so that this issue can be mitigated in future rounds and we can take further actions how to remedy this situation. So that's pretty much the answer that we're looking for. Some of the answers that we felt were incorrect was actually about asking more time, trying to extend the discussion. We have a strict rule on making sure that everything is discussed within 15 minutes and that if you go above that, you should vote. The reason being is if you take too long, then probably you are going to read into things. And also we have a schedule that we need to run as well. And so therefore it's important for us to not delay the competition. So asking for more time is simply not a feasible option and is obviously not preferred. And these were a lot of the answers that we got, which we felt was incorrect in a lot of the answers that was provided by the judges. All right, moving on to item number 2. You are judging a debate with the topic, "This House would make tertiary education free." Prime Minister argues that the government should make tertiary education free because tertiary education is very crucial for the nation's development. However, due to high tuition fees, many of those in the middle to lower class society are not able to access tertiary education. Leader of opposition argues that it's not necessary to make tertiary education free because many opportunities of scholarships are available in the status quo. Do you think Leader of Opposition's response is adequate? Please explain your answer. So the answer that we're looking for is as follows. So the Leader of Opposition's response is inadequate to address the problem brought by the Prime Minister. So the first one that was brought forth in OG was on the issue of affordability and inaccessibility to the middle, lower class society. So what the Leader of Opposition did in response was only saying that there is an alternative existing in status quo, but saying that something exists doesn't necessarily say why something works. And so therefore, we don't think that it sufficiently addresses the issue on whether or not scholarships would actually be effective in reaching the stakeholders that the Prime Minister advocated for. In this case, is the middle to lower class society. The second point that OG argued was that the state has an interest to make it free because it relates to the development of that nation. Now, opening opposition also never responded why that particular interest of the state can be shifted to another party, which is in this situation is scholarship provider. I think that's an important principle analysis that had to be debunked by a Leader of Op, and unfortunately they did not do that. And so that's why we felt that the responses provided was not sufficient to address the concerns that came in Prime Minister. All right. We also felt that there were some judges that argued that it was sufficient because at least they provided an alternative. Remember that when you are imposing a burden, you also need to be fair. So if you are questioning the opening government for how would making tertiary education free be effective, then you also need to impose the same question towards Leader of Opposition. And Leader of Opposition's material just basically says that something exists, which is scholarship, but there was no further backup analysis to that. And so therefore, for you to value it as sufficient would be quite problematic, given that it was very assertive and unelaborated. All right, moving on to the third item in the short answer. In a debate about the motion, this House would allow abortions. Opening government would only allow abortions when the mother's life is at risk. Closing government then argued that they would allow abortions in general, with far less restrictions or conditions than opening governments. And how would you value closing government in this debate? Now, we had a divergent sort of like responses when it comes to this. This is the answer that we're looking for, which is that closing government definitely cannot be higher than opening government in terms of their ranking, because their widening of stance clearly is a contradiction to the agreed upon setup, right? And which we also presume that opening opposition accepted. Otherwise, they would have challenged the definition or the limitations that opening government provided. Closing government can only widen the debate if OO has called out the soft stance and reject the definition, and therefore closing government chooses to follow OO. So the important element here is that if there is a sort of like a limited conception of definition or parameter that opening government brought, the only team that has the prerogative to widen and challenge that would be opening opposition. The closing debates do not have that, because if the opening opposition accepts, then the opening debate has agreed that this is a possible motion to be talked about. And so for the closing teams to suddenly shift that debate would only make two parallel debates that is discussing entirely different things. And that is not what BP debate is about. The second reason is whatever extensions that closing government may have probably would not be persuasive, given that their case studies or context would apply in scenarios other than when the mother's life is at risk. So given that they're going to talk about, for instance, women who are doing this because of their own choice, the fact that they want to do it because they want to like protect their education or their future, et cetera, that obviously would be outside of the purview of the limitations that opening government brought. So while we acknowledge what opening government did was a horrible case of soft stance, it was not a squirrel. And so therefore, there is a need for closing government not to knife the opening government and still be consistent. However, closing government is justified to call out and complain about how narrow the debate is that is decided by the opening government, but they should still stick with what was being said. Now, a lot of the judges actually answered that this is perfectly legitimate because, when you widen the debate, that is actually a good thing. There's like more room for discussions. It's important for judges to remember that this is not a valid strategy. Closing government cannot be the team that picks and chooses their own adventure, because that is not how BP debating works. As long as the opening has already agreed upon a specific setup, then the closing teams must follow. It is as simple as that. This is the agreed upon rule in WDC, and this is something that we also expect judges in NUDC to also implement when assessing similar circumstances in the future. Moving on to item number 4. All right, you are judging a debate about whether the education system and developed nations to teach children that they're personally liable for the suffering in developing countries. Now, OG argued that many kinds of suffering seen in developing countries are resulted from colonization, and that colonization is bad. OO agrees that colonization is bad, but other problems in developed countries, much closer to these children, such as racism and sexism, are more important to teach. Now, how do you evaluate this exchange? So this is sort of like a free-for-all type of scenario, because we felt that on the adjudication core that both teams did not really answer the motion. There were clear gaps with the argumentations provided by both opening government and opening opposition. And in these instances, the adjudicator can be given the prerogative to make a judgment call on what to prioritize. So what we're looking for in your answer is basically your reasoning or your justification of why one team is valued over the other. For instance, opening government can have the upper hand in this debate because opening opposition was simply unresponsive to the issue of colonization. What opening opposition did is basically a what about-ism, like opening government argues that there's a problem, and then opening opposition just say, but what about this problem? Introducing a different problem doesn't negate the initial problem that opening government talked about. So it is possible for you to credit opening government in having the upper hand because OO was simply unresponsive to the issues of colonization. Now, conversely, you can also credit opening opposition and give them the upper hand in comparison to the opening government because of the better link back of their arguments to the context of the debate, which is talking about education and also about the interest of children in the developed world, with the fact that racism and sexism is much more closer to them, therefore there is a necessity. So even if that they were not responsive, there was an element of link back that was much more closer to the motion in comparison to opening government that only talked about colonization being bad, but not necessarily why is it within the interest of education and children in the developed world to know about these things. So these like two scenarios are equally valid. What we're looking for again is your reasoning and justification on why one team had an upper hand over the other. All right, moving on to the fifth item and the short answers part. Okay, this one is rather long. On the motion, this House believes that we should create a matriarchal state for women. OO rejects the motion because 1, the new state will not be stable because gender support is a spectrum, thus not all women are supportive of each other. And 2, status quo trends show massive improvements. For example, many gender-friendly cabinets like in Canada and legislators like in Rwanda, and many global feminism movements such as Me Too and Lean In, among others, are very powerful. Now, closing opposition's reason to reject the motion are, number 1, that the new state will not be stable because human beings have the inherent tendency to create hierarchies. Thus, in a place where all gender is the same, they will subjugate using other traits such as race or religion. Also, number 2, status quo isn't that bad because nowadays corporations require creativity, which is gender blind. Social media allows strong and active criticism for politics and calling out. And young kids are taught in education to see gender blind. How do you evaluate OO versus EO? So the answer that the adjudication core has is that we believe that closing opposition wins slightly over opening opposition. And this is an important case study on when you have a closing team that had points that is similar in nature and premise with what the opening opposition talked about. Now, we could accept the arguments coming from judges that credits OO by saying that they were probably derivative. However, we would also like to hear which parts were derivative and why you couldn't credit the new nuances or the new explanations that closing opposition brought. Most of the judges that we saw only says it was basically the same, it was derivative, it was repetitive, but without really explaining in what specific terms. We thought that was problematic because while it was indeed similar, there were enough nuances and details that closing opposition brought, which was more analyzed and also made a huge difference in the way that we understand the case and the responses. So firstly, on the part of the harm, we felt that opening opposition's case tries to prove that women won't look out for each other, therefore the policy's benefit won't materialize. Now, in comparison to closing opposition, they explain the likelihood, which is that the nature on why individuals are probably not going to be supportive because the concept of hierarchies, the idea of them wanting to dominate and get power. And we think that this explains opening opposition's initial claim much better because opening opposition just asserted that women simply won't look out for each other, but there was no structural reasons why that would be the case. It was in closing opposition that there was an attempt to argue that. And so that's why we felt closing opposition had a slight advantage over opening opposition. Now, the second part is on the status quo. So opening opposition's response basically points out that there are many trends existing, like, in Canada and Rwanda, Me Too and Lean In. But the problem that we had was there was not an explanation of why these trends or these progresses would be effective to counteract the urgency of the round, right? Basically saying that there are these mechanisms doesn't explain why they would be effective. Whereas in closing opposition, they not only explain, for example, like actors like corporations, social media, and education, but they also talk about the structural analysis on why these actors would be a good countervailing force for the problem at hand. They talked about how corporations require creativity, social media has allowed for politics to be more accessible, education has progressed so much that allows people to no longer, or at least be less sexist in comparison to those in the past. We felt that that explains the effectiveness much better in comparison to opening opposition that only talks about trends, but not explaining whether or not those trends necessarily translate into something that would be an effective solution to the problem. And so that's why we felt that closing opposition had a slight advantage over the opening opposition. All right, so those are the answers for this short answers section. Now let's move on to the debate assessment. Before that, I'm just going to take a sip of water. Excellent, moving on. So for the debate assessment, here are the rankings and scores that the adjudication core provided. So we gave the first ranking to the opening government, the second rank to the closing opposition, the third rank to the opening opposition, and the fourth to the closing government. In general, we felt that it was a clear-cut debate between the top two and the bottom two. So we felt that the contention for the top two places were clearly between opening government and closing opposition, and the contention for the bottom two is between opening opposition and closing government. So we've seen judges with a variation of these results. Some judges gave closing opposition first over opening government, and some judges gave closing government third in comparison to opening opposition. We felt that those calls were fair because we felt that it was relatively quite close between the long diagonal and also the short diagonal. However, we felt that the decisions that deviated from that, for example, giving closing government first or giving opening government fourth, we felt that those decisions are quite questionable because we felt that the debate was a bit clear-cut and relatively easy to assess. The scorings are as such. We're going to have a detailed breakdown of what the scores represent and what were the particular contributions that led them into being scored as such. All right. Now, before we move on to the assessment on the ranking and also on the scores, we're going to discuss a bit about noticeable patterns in the oral adjudication and also your judgment call that we felt important to correct. There are 5 things, so please bear with us. The first is stepping into the debate. So many oral adjudications that we heard indicated that judges are completing arguments on behalf of the debaters. Please do not do this. Take into account only what was explained by the speakers. Just because you've heard or thought of a similar and better version of the argument does not justify you to fill in the gaps for them. And we saw many of the judges doing this, and we think that is not okay because your role as a judge is to be an average, reasonable person. You are not a part of the debate. You're going to vote on which team did better, and therefore you must take that neutral observer perspective when it comes to assessing the debates. The second pattern that we want to talk about is that we noticed that there's an issue with accent or fluency bias. So we saw that many judges highly credit the opposition member and giving her the best speaker. So while we think that it may still be plausible to credit her as such, given the fact that we also felt there were a lot of important contributions in the opposition member's speech, we also felt that most of the explanations that we heard on her are reliant on assertive points which were not fully explained. And we felt that then this overcrediting phenomenon was largely due to people's bias on hearing her American accent and making it seem like it was far clearer to understand in comparison to some other speakers. And conversely, we also felt that some judges were very uncharitable They were discrediting points made by some speakers who have a more Indonesianized accent with their English, particularly for prime minister and also for leader of opposition. So what we also noticed is that there was only highlighting the title of the points without really digging into the details provided. We felt that when it comes to being a judge, assessment of content should be holistic. So accent should not matter to the extent that it does not disrupt the delivery of one's content. And we felt that nobody in the round had any issue when it comes to delivery or clarity for that matter. And so therefore, we really, really need judges to not be easily swayed just because someone has like a relatively westernized accent in comparison to like an Indonesianized accent of their English, or have more fluency in that regard. The third thing that we want to talk about is on judges being non-comparative. So of the OAs that we listened to, many judges that we assessed were very parrot-like, only regurgitating back the contents of the speakers without really giving any rationale or any comparison on why a certain point, a certain argument, a certain response was triumphant over another. And we think that this becomes problematic because then judges tend to punish a team for not doing something, but then simultaneously not applying the same burden to the other team that ranked above them. And we think that this is critical, is that in debate, you have to be balanced when you're imposing one burden for one team. Like let's say you're imposing a burden that a specific team did not explain characterization on parents, then you also need to see whether or not the other teams did that much better than the team that did not. What's important to note is that many judges did not even compare opening opposition and closing government, and many of the judges actually presumes opening opposition as an automatic fourth. We just want to really clarify that there is no such thing as an automatic fourth. You can have the worst speech in your life that you think is bad, but that doesn't mean it's an automatic fourth. So because there might be others that are performing worse than that. So there are no such thing as automatic fourth. Each contribution must be analyzed. Teams are going to make mistakes, but they're also going to make some good points, and therefore you should also evaluate that accordingly. Number 4 is that we feel that the judges need to read the speaker score scale. We provided the scale for judges in the judge seminar slides to use as a reference and not just as a suggestion. Now, we've seen a few problems popping up in the scoring element. So first, we also saw judges that are using extreme scores, which is the 60s and the 90s. There were like some speakers that are getting like scores of like 63s and 65s, and there's also speakers that are getting like 91s and 93s, which we felt does not reflect the quality of the debate. The debate was relatively average to above average, but it's definitely not below average or ultimately very excellent. So please read the description on the speaker score scale. The second part that we want to highlight here is that there's also judges who are being very stingy, that are sticking to the low 70s range and unwilling to go above 79. Like getting an 80 or the low 80s range from like 81 to 85, it does not require you to be godlike, right? It doesn't require you to have like the most perfect argument, but it requires you to have persuasive points and oftentimes multi-layered, sometimes responses and good contextualization. It is definitely very accessible, and it's important for judges to not be very stingy and to take a look at the description that is being provided in the speaker score scale. The third problem that we also notice is quite apparent is there are judges that are giving the same total scores for two teams that causes a draw. This is not a thing in BP. You must make sure that a team that ranks higher would have a higher accumulative score. They can never have the same total score, because that's going to mess up the tab. Like the tab system is going to reject that from being entered. So please do your maths. If you cannot do your maths, technology exists called a calculator. Make sure that you use that to your advantage so that everyone can, have a good time, especially for the tab team. Yeah, now, and given the fact that we're also going to use the scores from the exhibition debate, that will be your standards for the tournament. So please calibrate and remember that if you see a speech, use the exhibition debate as a benchmark on whether or not they were approximate to the scoring that we provided on them. Right, and then the fifth pattern that we really need to highlight is when to credit points. So here are some tips from the ACH core on how judges should consider when you're assessing points made by the teams. A, was the point relevant? B, was the point important? And C, did they explain why this point should be a priority in the debate? We felt that a lot of the judges are crediting a point because it's new or because it's distinct. Just because it's new or distinct doesn't mean it's automatically valuable. You have to see the argument in the context of the dynamic of the round. You have to assess that argument with all of the other arguments that the teams have provided. You have to see whether or not the teams make an effort to explain why their argument should matter more, should be considered more weight, should have more importance in comparison to the previous arguments that the other teams have talked about. It cannot be assessed in isolation. It cannot be assessed in a vacuum. So these are 5 noticeable patterns that we noted from the oral adjudications that everyone should definitely take into account and try to correct in the future. All right, now let's move on to the debate assessment on the rankings explanation. So the first rank went to the opening government. So I'm going to compare why opening government was triumphant over the other 3 teams. So first, the comparison with closing opposition, which was the second rank. There are 3 things. Firstly, opening government's points on the state necessity to take preventive action stood until the end of the debate. Closing opposition had proposed alternatives of emancipation laws, but we felt that that was not addressing the issue well, because it still requires some degree of harm to take place before it being a viable solution, i.e., someone would need to experience a certain trauma or abuse or injury before they can decide if they want to be emancipated from, their parents or their legal guardians. And so therefore, the proposed alternative coming from closing opposition is still curative in nature. And opening government's entire case was talking about how, curative measures have simply been insufficient in addressing child abuse and addressing all of the injuries and harms that they have experienced in the status quo. And so that's why we need to take a more preventive action. We felt that that point stood strong until the end of the round, that even closing opposition's attempt to debunk that was unsuccessful. The second reason is the case of forced abortion that closing opposition talked about was a straw man, because while it was a very interesting harm, a very strong harm, in fact, about women's body autonomy being robbed from them, however, Deputy Prime Minister clearly responded in the POI from opposition member that raised this issue, which is that abortion is the choice for the women if they want to take them. That is totally fine. So acknowledging that it was an option, but it's not the primary one that is coercive in nature. Additionally as well, the argument was uncomparative, which is that even if we were to accept that forced abortions are going to take place, we felt that closing opposition still needed to frame their arguments on why the impacts to women should be the most important argument that we should prioritize in this round. And unfortunately, closing opposition did not do that. Finally, which is on the harms of parents being more abusive because license gives a sense of moral righteousness. This is the second extension that closing opposition talked about. This was preempted mechanistically quite well by opening government when they talked about, with licenses, there is also revocation. If you do not fulfill the standards and conditions of carrying that license. You also have reporting mechanisms, and these are also mechanisms that closing opposition concedes that are available and also effective. So I felt that a lot of the harms coming from the closing opposition was beautifully preempted by opening government, and those were the reasons why opening government was triumphant over closing opposition. Now let's compare with the other two teams. So the reason why opening government was triumphant over opening opposition was that they were able to debunk many issues that opening opposition talked about, especially on the status quo alternative mechanisms. Opening government managed to point out why creative measures is simply not working, and it is not principally acceptable for us to subject children to harm, and then only doing something after the fact, which is the post-facto rebuttal that opening government in the DPM talked about. And the second response that we credit was the right to have children. Opening government in DPM also made a really strong case study about adoptive parents, which is the idea that in status quo, we discriminate between biological parents and adoptive parents. So, this necessarily means that the right to have children isn't really an absolute right. And therefore, it demonstrates that there are conditions that can be made when it comes to deciding if whether or not a person is fit to become a parent or a guardian of a child. The second reason is the principle of happiness of parents was also effectively responded to when the DPM was able to compare a lot of the irreversible harms that children suffer from and why it should be weighted more. We felt that the opening opposition only just asserted that parents deserve happiness, but there was no explanation of whether or not that happiness should come at the cost of children suffering. And we felt that that was the framing that opening government provided, and we felt that that managed to make them win over opening opposition. Finally, between opening government and closing government, we felt that most of closing government's material was highly derivative of the opening government's case, especially on states' responsibility to protect. We felt that while there were some additional details and examples, we felt that the end conclusion and our understanding of the argument remained the same. So we couldn't really credit closing government much for that. The second reason is in terms of responses, we felt that opening government had better direct responses to opening opposition, and they also managed to preemptively deal with a lot of the harms that came from closing opposition, whereas we felt that closing gov was relatively defensive against opening opposition. They only used their case, which was again a repetition of opening government's material, and more critically is that they were unresponsive to closing opposition's new materials. And they were the only team that had the ability to directly respond to closing opposition, but they did not do that. So we felt that opening government was given a more upper hand in this particular exchange in terms of responses and engagement. So those were the assessment why we felt that the first ultimately goes to the opening government. All right, the second goes to closing opposition. So the first exchange is between closing opposition and why they win over opening opposition. I'm not going to explain why they lost out to opening government because I've already done that in the previous assessment. So there are three reasons. Firstly, closing opposition provided characterization on individuals' capacity to parent that is much better than opening opposition. Opening opposition only said that parents can learn over time, but there was no explanation on the likelihood of success on parents actually learning over time. Closing opposition talked about various cultures existing to actually guide them and make them be able to truly function as a parent. So we felt that that characterization was much better in closing opposition. The second reason is we felt that closing opposition's harms are more concrete, especially on women and also potentially abusive parents, whereas opening opposition asserted that there will be harms to underprivileged parents or parents that are socioeconomically poor, but there's just literally no explanations on what those harms were and why those harms were in particular that impactful and therefore should be prioritized in the debate. The third reason is closing opposition provided stronger responses to the government's case, especially on status quo mechanisms. So while opening opposition did mention things like having social welfare programs, having like laws and its enforcement, but they were not really explaining why those are effective to address a lot of the abuse concerns and problem that open government brought. In closing opposition, they talked about emancipation laws and why specifically it can address a lot of the issues, which is the idea that emancipation laws takes into account a case-per-case approach rather than license that are presumptuous and generalizes circumstances. So we felt that closing opposition provided stronger response to the government's case, especially on status quo mechanisms. The second exchange is between closing opposition and closing government. So we felt that in terms of the principle analysis, closing opposition's principle on bodily autonomy was just simply left unresponded. That was one of the biggest nuance that closing opposition brought in the debate. And the government whip was unsuccessful in trying to engage with that particular argumentation. Whereas if we were to compare on the principal argument that closing government brought, they talked about the state duty on limited resource, which then closing opposition managed to debunk when in the opposition member, they provided a contextual clarification about the distinction between developing nations and the developed world and why a lot of the arguments and the stances that closing government wanted is simply contradictory because they exist in two different contexts. And we felt that that was a much more creditable response and exchange when it comes to the principle analysis. So those were the reasons why closing opposition wins over opening opposition and closing government. Right, and then the final ranking between the opening opposition, why they are third, and why closing government takes the fourth. So there are two things. Firstly, opening opposition's case on children being the source of happiness for family was simply not responded by closing government. Closing government asserted that children may be unhappy too, but proving that children may be unhappy does not negate why you should take away a source of happiness that families want through getting their children. So we felt that that was not a sufficient response coming from the closing government to the material of the opening opposition. The second reason is closing government provided a shift of actor, which is on the state, that the state need to take into account limited resources and also budget efficiency. It was not framed adequately on why this should matter more than OO's emphasis on parents and families' rights. Opening opposition at least tried to justify why parents deserve to have these rights because without having children, they would feel that their lives would be emptier. They would not feel a sense of happiness that others are able to access when they have children. We felt that there was an explanation of why it was valuable to prioritize parents and family. Closing government did not explain why prioritizing the state is something that is valuable, especially when you talk about limited resource and budget efficiency. So these comparisons then ultimately puts opening opposition in the third rank and closing government in the fourth rank. And those are the reasonings behind our rankings. All right, now moving on to the last part of the assessment, which is the scoring breakdown. So let's start with the opening government, who got first. So for the Prime Minister, we gave her an 81 to 82, whereas for the Deputy Prime Minister, we gave him an 83 to 85. So the reason we gave Prime Minister an 81 to 82 is we thought that this was a relatively above average speech. We felt that the Prime Minister provided strong setup and mechanization of the debate, showing a track record, taking classes, revocation of license when the conditions are void. We felt that that setup was quite contributive, especially when it comes to preempting a lot of the harms and the negative consequences that closing opposition talked about. Second, they also preemptively argued why status quo mechanisms are insufficient to address the urgency of child abuse, which is the fact that they're curative in nature, which is inherently bad because the children will already have experienced harm and therefore your policy is not going to help them recover much better because they've already been subject to injury and suffering. The third reason is we felt that the Prime Minister provided a robust principle analysis on the state duty and capacity to protect children as the most vulnerable actor. What we want to highlight here is that the emotive portrayal in Prime Minister's speech was excellently done to demonstrate degrees of harm and why the status quo mechanisms are simply just not sufficient to prevent the specific psychological impacts that children are most likely going to suffer because their parents are not ready. I think this is a really good example of doing characterization. I think a lot of the judges sort of undervalued the contribution that Prime Minister had because the case studies sound like personal anecdotes, but if you look at the logic and the portrayal behind that, it is actually very valuable because it demonstrates a lot of the harms and about the psychological realm that is difficult to be addressed under the status quo. So those were the reasons why we felt that the Prime Minister deserves an 81 to an 82. The Deputy Prime Minister, we gave 83 through 85, so we felt that Deputy Prime Minister was the best speaker in the round. Firstly, is we felt that the Deputy Prime Minister had really, really strong responses, even in the first minute of his speech, by using parallel case studies to debunk a lot of the opening opposition's material. Firstly, on adoptive parents having requirements to be able to have children, but not biological. And this was a very strategic case study to debunk the argument on right of parents to have children. Second is also the concept of licenses that exist in status quo to ensure the right holder's capacity to be responsible. These were very, very strong responses to tackle down a lot of the arguments that came from the opening opposition. The second reason why we felt that the Deputy Prime Minister deserves 83 to 85 is we felt that they also managed to debunk all of opening opposition's material. For instance, those who failed the test can learn, hence able to apply for the license when they improve themselves, basically saying that this will not reduce the right of parents in any meaningful way because they can still get it as long as they fulfill the conditions. And given the fact that opening opposition agrees that parents can learn, therefore it is something that is inherently attainable by their own logic. So we felt that that was a really, really strong response and flipping of logic by the Deputy Prime Minister. They also did a really good comparative that relying on pure willingness to learn is actually a bad gamble because there's no reinforcement mechanism whatsoever to ensure that they are truly learning. So we felt that not only that the Deputy Prime Minister debunked opening opposition's faulty premise, but they also managed to use it against their case. Finally, the Deputy Prime Minister strengthened the principle of the state protection to the vulnerable, talking about the reliance on harm probability and the irreversibility nature of the harms. Now, this is a really good example of a speech that didn't really have much positive or constructive argument in terms of material. It consisted a lot in terms of responses, but those responses were very spot on. And we highly value these responses as a contribution provided by the Deputy Prime Minister. So Prime Minister 81 to 82, Deputy Prime Minister 83 until 85. Next, for the opening opposition. So we gave Leader of Opposition 77 to 78 and the Deputy Leader of Opposition 74 to 75. So we gave Leader of Opposition 77 to 78. So we felt that the Leader of Opposition did provide responses to opening government's case. However, they were presented as shoplifting of existing mechanisms in status quo without really explaining how they're more effective than the motion. So when they talked about welfare, how they talked about social services by the government, these are possible alternatives, but not really explaining why they are effective, therefore debunking the necessity of the motion. The second reason is we felt that a Leader of Opposition developed the principle very sufficiently on the right to have children, For example, the analysis on parental abilities are developed over time. They are a source of family's happiness. We felt that it was well constructed in terms of like a principal argumentation. However, the reason why we don't think that this speaker can get the above average of the 80s range was that the argument was quite uncomparative, especially to the PM's principle on why that the right of parents to have children was far more important than the children's need to be protected by the state from potential abusive parents. And so that's why we felt that this argument could not reach the above average of like 80 scoring range level. The third reason is we also felt that leader of opposition brought harm, which is that underprivileged parents are going to suffer, but they did not sufficiently argue why they were the majority or a stakeholder that we should care the most about, and also what were these harms. There was just very minimal explanation when it comes to that. So those were the reasons why we felt that leader of opposition got between 77 to 78. For deputy leader of opposition, we gave DLO 74 to 75. So the reasons were as follows. Firstly, we felt that the responses to opening government were defensive. DLO did a good job in trying to revive the argument on parents' rights, but it was still uncomparative, and it was just not developed more. And so that's why we felt that it was kind of repetitive. The second reason is DLO argued on the presence of government assistance to prevent harms. I think trying to build on the response on existing mechanisms as an alternative solution, but it was basically underexplained, not really elaborated why it was sufficient to ensure child's welfare. And the third reason is there was a potential point on choice, which is that parents knows what's best for themselves and also for their children. However, the elaboration then developed and became similar to leader of opposition's material on parents' ability to learn on the job. So we felt that that point was also repetitive. And so that's why we value deputy leader of opposition relatively average to slightly below average. Right, so leader of opposition 77 to 78, deputy leader of opposition 74 to 75. Moving on to the closing half. So for both speakers on the closing government, we gave them range between 74 to 76. So for the government member, there were two reasons. Firstly, the extension was highly derivative of opening government. So while the member did attempt to add in details on harms to children, for example, parents being poor, the existence of slum areas that are filled with crime, the issue of overpopulation, these details did not change the conclusion or our understanding of the argument, which is the idea that these children are going to suffer. They're not going to live the most optimal quality of life that they can enjoy if their parents are not ready or in a optimal condition. And so therefore, we don't think that they managed to sufficiently change our understanding or our perception of the argumentation that is being brought on the government side. So what's the first reason? The second is in terms of the response. So the response to OO solution was contradictory. So the government member said that government has limited resources, but at the same time, they also want to have high welfare policies like OO proposed, like basically saying that we're going to have these things like in complementary and things like that. We were a bit confused on how can they argue government limited resource, but at the same time, also wanting to have high welfare. And so that's why it became a bit blurry on what exactly is it that the closing government stands for. And those were the reasons why I felt that the speech went into slightly below average for a government member. As for the government whip, so we felt the government whip did a couple of things. We felt that there was interesting approaches. However, these approaches were difficult to value as above average. So firstly, government whip had an interesting approach in responding to the opposition member by talking about changing of culture and the way that we see children. Unfortunately, there were many loopholes about this point. First, we felt that this was relatively new material. Nobody talked about this before. But also, even if it was not new material, we don't think that it was responsive enough to opposition members' harm towards women, and also the harms to potential abusive parents due to licensing. And so that's what we felt, that while the point was indeed interesting, it was simply just not responsive to the new things that opposition member talked about. The second reason is we felt that Government Whip brought a different focus, which is that we needed to talk about state budget and how it needed to be efficient. The problem here is that it was just simply not comparative. They never framed why it was more important to address the drain on state resources than other stakeholders. For example, OG talked about prioritizing children as a vulnerable actor. Opening opposition talks about parents and family as an important unit to be protected. Closing opposition talks about women in specific. So in order for this argument to work, the Government Whip needed to frame that argument, that point. But there was just simply no effort in doing that. And so that's why we felt that the Government Whip also felt slightly below average. Right, lastly, for the closing opposition, we felt that the opposition member and the opposition whip both deserve above average, which is the scores that we're giving them is between 81 to 82. So let's talk about the opposition member. So we felt that opposition member made a critical response to CJ's argument by differentiating context between developing and developed nations, how it's just simply impossible for them to have all of these like welfare policies, but at the same time also having limited resource, which is a trait of developing nations. That was very effective in pointing out the contradiction in the approach done by closing government. So we highly credit the opposition member for that. Second is we also felt that opposition member had more effort to explain status quo mechanisms effectiveness. So what opposition member did was not to like shoplist the mechanisms that exist currently, but they just picked one, which is emancipation law. And then they explain why emancipation law is likely to be effective because the approach is a more case-per-case basis rather than license that usually generalizes people's circumstances. We felt that that was far better in comparison to the opening opposition, for instance, that only shop-listed alternatives but not explain why those alternatives would necessarily work. We felt that there was a unique principle approach in the opposition member on women's bodily autonomy, primarily on mental trauma. Now, the reason why we felt that this argument couldn't be elevated into higher score was that the explanation was contingent on a strawman premise of forcing abortion. That all of the other harms of like mental trauma, about women suffering and not being able to recover, that was contingent on that women will be forced to have abortions. Unfortunately, opposition member did not really provide us with that link. How is it that forced abortions are going to take place? Finally, there was a distinct harm that opposition member talked about, that it gives a free pass, for parents to be abusive in the future, given that they have a license. However, it was quite jumpy. Given that this was like in the later minutes of their speech, we don't think that there was like sufficient like backup analysis to demonstrate why these harms are likely to occur. So those were the reasons why I felt that opposition member deserves 81 to 82. For the opposition whip, we also gave them the same score. So for three reasons. Firstly, opposition whip did a good job to glorify the opposition's member unique principle on women's bodily autonomy. However, the reason why their score could not be higher was that there was also no comparison on why this principle is the most important in the round. Because especially when you need to compare with opening government with first, you need to talk about why the harms to children are far of less importance in comparison to the harms to women's bodily autonomy. They also need to explain the process analysis of the forced abortion argument that forced abortion premise that opposition member also discussed. The second reason is opposition whip provided a new harm, which is that government are going to streamline how to parent and dictate how individuals should raise their kids. We felt that it was quite assertive, and even then, there was no explanation why it was a bad thing. Opposition whip relied on the idea that the word dictation somehow would imply a negative harm, but we just didn't see what was problematic with that. Um, Opposition whip also attempted to revive the second extension of opposition member on parents having moral righteousness because of the license. We felt that this provided some degree of analysis that was missing in the opposition member's speech on the second extension. However, we felt that this was also still assertive because there was no further explanation on this moral righteousness element, and we felt that that was insufficient to truly tackle the arguments that came from the opening government. So opposition member 81 to 82, and also opposition whip 81 to 82. All right, that concludes the discussion on the answers of the judge test. We hope that you find this valuable and insightful. If you have any questions, feel free to approach any members of the Adjudication Corps, either on WhatsApp or Discord, and we'll be happy to entertain your questions. Thank you so much, and see you in NUDC.